Khanna.
Grazie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so honored to be with you today. Every visit to an Italian city or island makes me feel that I must have been an Italian in a previous life. It brings me such incredible joy to be here. And I'm glad for those of you who came on a later ferry that you made it to enjoy this experience. Now, I love this theme, always human. There is nothing more human than the desire to connect with other people. Here we are in person, connecting with each other, speaking with each other face to face. But for every other kind of interaction that we have with others around the world, with our friends, with our colleagues, family, business, pleasure, requires some kind of physical connectivity, some kind of physical infrastructure. And the word connectivity is so interesting. You know, we all have our mobile phones. I can see some of you already taking pictures. We think to young people, especially today, when you say the word connectivity, they think it is a wireless thing, right? They're connected. They have this device. It's not connected to anything else. At least they don't see the connectivity. But in fact, all connectivity rests on some fundamental infrastructure, right? Some infrastructure. Without infrastructure, you don't have connectivity. So what I do with my maps is to physically show you the things that we take for granted. We take for granted this connectivity. And your theme here today is about the digital. But you also don't have the digital connectivity without the physical connectivity. Let me jump to a simple example. Alibaba, fastest growing e-commerce company of the last decade, valued now at $400 billion. And people ask, where is India's version of Alibaba? So it's very simple. Where are the highways and the railways and the airports in India that match China? You don't get the $400 billion digital e-commerce Alibaba until you have the highways and the railways, the airports, all of that physical connectivity. These two things go together. Now, it's not just about economics. I enjoyed already the previous presentations setting the stage, talking about us, humans, our values, right? And to me, again, this connectivity, this map of infrastructure I'm showing you here, I'm showing you all of the world's transportation networks, energy networks, communications networks, right? Highways and railways, oil and gas pipelines, electricity grids, fiber optic internet cables. We built these things, right? No one forced us to do it. It is very human to want to connect. Now, here's the first myth then that needs to be abolished. It's the idea that first and foremost we are tribal, right? That we must identify first and foremost into an ethnic, national enclave. That is who we are, right? And there's many anthropologists who will make that claim. What do they say to this? How can what they say be true and this also be true? That for 100,000 years, since man wandered out of Africa, began colonizing the continents and spreading around the world, every technology we have, whether it is stones, whether it is steel, whether it is aviation, whether it is telephony, telegraphs, every technology we have, we use it to connect to other people. That is also very much who we are. And so when people say today, looking at just one quarter, right, or 2 quarters or 1 year, looking in the short term and saying globalization is in retreat. Globalization is going backwards. This is the end of globalization. I hear it every day. I hear it every 5 minutes. It's so silly to me because we're just getting warmed up. Most of the lines on this map were built in just the last 50 or 60 years, right? And we're just getting started. We're spending far more on infrastructure collectively as a species, as governments, as companies, than we do on anything else. So think big picture. The digital layer is the newest layer on top of the other layers, and it's growing faster than any other. So let's talk about where that is going to take us. What are the implications of this? Now, let's also talk about the historical milestone that's really catapulting us into the future. Because, interestingly enough, here we are in the year 2019. In exactly 3 weeks, we will, the cameras will return to the city of Berlin. November 9th, 1989. Does everyone remember where they were? Does everyone remember where they were when the wall came down? 30 years goes by very quickly. Actually, for me, it was a very personal moment because I was living in New York, and I was 12 years old, but my parents said, this is just amazing. We watched it on TV. And a couple of weeks later, we got on a plane and we went to Berlin. And so the event that changed my life was watching the fall of the Berlin Wall and then going to Berlin and taking a hammer and hammering away at the wall because, it was more than 100 kilometers around. So it took a long time to take it all down. So 30 years ago is when the world really began to change. And there are so many things that have happened in the last 30 years that we would not have imagined today looking back. But now, in retrospect, we can see how these trends have added onto each other cumulatively to propel us into a more connected future. So the end of the Cold War itself. And that allowed globalization, when we think about financial markets and trade networks and so forth, to truly go global. So much of the world, the communist world, the Soviet world, was not part of the global economic institutions of the Cold War era. But now they joined. So globalization actually became global, truly, only 30 years ago. How can you declare an end to something that's only just been going for 30 years if you think about the true extent of globalization? Along with that, you had more shifts in the international political economy. Deregulation, privatization, and then, of course, the infrastructure build-out. The capital that was committed to rebuilding former Soviet republics, post-colonial countries, and so forth. All of these trends. And then, what also happened in 1989? For us, for our generation, 1989 will always be the fall of the Berlin Wall. But you know that most of the people alive today who are under the age of 40 have no recollection of that moment. They don't really remember it, right? It wasn't part of their consciousness, right? They remember 1989, it's the year that the World Wide Web was founded, right? Same year, World Wide Web, only 30 years old. So again, all of these forces have been accelerating in precisely that time. And now we have what I would call total globalization. It is universal. The volume of trade or data flows or movement of people between any two parts of the world may go up one year, may go down one year. But what we are building through infrastructure, digitization, is the capacity to be global. The capacity to be global is more important than any one statistic and its volatility any given year. Europe needs to have more confidence in its role in this globally connected future. In the last 30 years, Europe has led the world in using infrastructure, connectivity, institutions, and reforms to create a connected community, right? That's what we call the European Union, right? You may be optimistic about it, you may be pessimistic about it. I know that Italian governments can rise and fall on this issue. But the fact is that there's no other region of the world that has been so proactive about using connectivity in all of its forms. It is, in a way, so powerful. The transnational connectivity embeds each country so deeply into the European system that it is like that proverbial egg that cannot be unscrambled. And that's why, that for 10 years, people have said there'll be Grexit, no Grexit. Italy will leave the EU and the Eurozone. Hasn't happened either, right? 10 years worth of people saying that these things would happen, and even as a non-European, I was quite certain it wouldn't happen. Because when you look at the way in which financial regulation, the legal regulatory processes, course, the currency and energy markets are so integrated. How can you take it all apart? And in a way, what connectivity does is create a whole greater than the sum of its parts, right? Europe is much stronger through this process of connectivity, despite the weaknesses, despite the areas where coordination is difficult, much, much stronger together. Again, a whole greater than the sum of its parts. Now, here's something that perhaps we weren't paying attention to over the last 30 years. We've been busy. We've been busy with the European process, dealing with the end of the Cold War, uniting East and West Germany, creating a common currency here in Europe. Then you had the wars in the Balkans. We had across the Western world, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, of course, the Gulf Wars as well, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had the financial crisis. We've had Trump and Brexit. We've been pretty busy in the Western world, so you can be forgiven for not paying as much attention to what Asia was doing over the last 30 years. But they've gotten very connected too, as you probably know. Asia leads the world in infrastructure spending. You already know that the 5G networks are being deployed more rapidly in Asia than in the rest of the world. A lot has happened over here. Now, I mentioned a whole bunch of things that we all identify with, that we remember over the last 30 years. Not one of those things matters to the 5 billion people on this map. The majority of the human population, 5 billion people, lives here, right? In Asia. And by the way, this is the correct definition of Asia. Asia is not just China, right? The geographic definition of Asia begins at the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to the east, and from Russia all the way to Australia. That's Asia. 5 billion people. And for them, right, things like the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, even though they were in Asia, it was our war. It was a Western war, right? It was our financial crisis. It's our Brexit and Trump. Not the most important things that happened here. Who turned on the television 2 or 3 days ago and saw the parade in Beijing, right? That's what China has been thinking about. It's been thinking about 70 years since the establishment of the People's Republic, right? It's been thinking about 40 years since Shenzhen in southern China became China's first special economic zone. Open markets, attracted investment, China became the factory floor of the world. It built up its trade surpluses, its currency reserves, became what in purchasing power parity terms, the world's largest economy. Asia has been focused on doing all of those things, reforms, economic reforms, and maintaining geopolitical stability. So the milestones for the majority of the world population are different from our milestones, but one thing that they have in common with the big historical patterns is a huge focus on connectivity. So I mentioned 5 billion people. Now, that's not just a temporary condition. As you know, in Italy, in particular, Europe in general, and the West in general, our populations are flat, even declining a little bit, right? So the fact that Asia has the majority of the world population is not just for today. It will be true for all of our lifetimes until we die. It will be true for our children's lifetimes, right? That Asia is the majority of the world population. So we have to start to think about how they view the world, how they view globalization, how they are not just receiving globalization, not just receiving our supply chains when we outsource to them, receiving our investment, right? But now as a driver of globalization. That is what is happening in the next phase. And part of what is making Asia so powerful so quickly is one form of connectivity, which is urbanization, right? People moving to cities, and cities becoming as important as countries as nodes in the world economy. And I mentioned Shenzhen right here, right? What China has done over the last 40 years, and particularly over the last 10 years, is to rethink its administrative geography, which is to say that even though, like Italy, it is a country of many historical provinces with their own unique attributes, dialects, cultures, culinary habits, histories of autonomy, and so forth, right? In Italy, you can very much relate to that phenomenon. China, of course, is like that too, right? Quite discrete subcultures. But anyway, they have said, we need to reorganize ourselves into these 24 megacity urban clusters. And each of them will have a very large population with the total of the cities within them, anywhere from 30 million to 50 million people, right? In the case of Chongqing and Chengdu, here you're talking about more than 50 million people in this zone, right? So imagine just one cluster may have as many people as your entire country in just one Asian country, which is only 1.4 billion people out of the 5 billion people. And remember, you can fit all of Western Europe inside just Southeast Asia, right? I need you to understand the scale of what we are talking about here. It's a very big story, and it's just lifting off. So we cannot be so certain about the way the future is going simply from our point of view over here. Now, by the way, in Italy, as you know, you've had a debate about whether also Italy should be reorganized into metropolitan regions, right? This was one of the priorities of one of the previous administrations. There is a very sensible logic to that. Even though you, again, have these distinct provincial histories, a successful economy is one built on successful cities, right? And the most powerful countries are those that have the largest number of functioning cities, that distribute their populations, that have many connected hubs. And that's what China has set out to do. Now, I don't want to be too China-centric. I want you to get a sense of how rapidly change is occurring in this region, because the story actually of Asia's rise really does begin with Japan. Remember that it was 75 years ago, after World War II, that Japan began its very rapid ascent. By 1975, Japan was already the world's second largest economy. It overtook West Germany already within one generation. And that inspired the tiger economies, right? South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And that brings us to that 1979 moment when China decided that, look at our neighbors, look at Japan, look at South Korea, look at Singapore. They've become so wealthy so fast. Why can't we do that? And that's when China began its reforms, and that made China the third wave of Asian growth. Now, all of us look to China, China, China all the time, right? You hear Donald Trump also obsess about China. But you have to view this process in an evolutionary way, in an additive and a cumulative way, because what has been missing in our conversations is the next set of markets, what I call the fourth wave of growth, right? First wave, Japan. Second wave, tigers. Third wave, China. Now, the fourth wave. Now, look at this number. 2.5 billion people live in the countries painted orange here. 2.5 billion people. That's much larger than the population of China. It's not one country, but all of these countries have a younger population than China, right? In the case of India, its total population is almost the same as China, but the median age is 15 years younger than China's median age, right? So you have younger countries, a larger population, faster growth rates in many cases, and receiving more foreign investment. And all of that started before the trade war. And now with the US-China trade war, as you know, you have a massive diversion of investment out of China into these countries as well. There's a punchline that we have in the region. We say, the US-China trade war is over. Vietnam is the winner, right? And you can fill in the blank. You can substitute Vietnam for any number of countries that has been taking advantage by rising and opening at exactly the right time, which is the last 10 years or so. So view Asia as something much, much bigger. Now let's talk about connectivity again in the context of what Asia has been doing and what it means for you. Over the last 30 years of all of these forces of globalization, the end of colonialism, the end of the Cold War, Asian countries have been figuring out how to leverage their complementarities. On this map, you have natural resource producers, oil, gas, food. You have industrial centers, right? Those that have the manufacturing output and the industry. You have financial centers in capitals like Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong. You have, of course, digital centers, right? Countries that are leaders in advanced technology like Japan and Korea and China as well. So you see these enormous complementarities that Asians have with each other, and so they trade more with each other than they do with the whole rest of the world. Right? So the question is, if you are pessimistic about globalization, right, it's because you are not sufficiently connected to those places that are getting more connected, right? Imagine if you're sitting in London right now, if you're British, and you're saying, oh, this globalization thing is just, falling off a cliff. It's not that globalization is falling off a cliff. You are falling off a cliff. Your country has fallen off a cliff. Globalization doesn't need you. You need globalization, right? This is the special thing about a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. This is happening. This is real. This is not a forecast of 50 years from now. This is last year's data, right? So either you get connected to it or you don't, right? And actually, this is, I'll jump ahead a little bit. When you think about Belt and Road, right? And you think about the ways in which Asia is building these infrastructure networks of transportation, energy, communications, the digital Silk Road, and so forth, there is so much potential, and here we are in Europe just off to the left, so much potential in getting connected to this story. Again, more than 5 billion people live here. Many of these countries are post-colonial, post-Soviet. They've underinvested. They have huge populations that are fast-growing, and you want to trade more with them. The way in which, for example, Germany has been doing, with very large trade surpluses, very strong trade linkages with Asia. And so, when Italy decided to join the Belt and Road Initiative earlier this year, there was a lot of criticism in Berlin, in Paris, in Brussels, and so forth. I'm on record, I was very defensive of Italy, right? I came to Italy's defense, and I'll tell you why for a couple of reasons. First of all, Italy wants to be part of that story, right? Why should Germany have so much more trade with China and Asia and not Italy, right? That's very, very logical to want to be part of global growth networks, right? That's the first thing. The other is, if you look at a map, not this map, but a map of Europe, it's very simple. If you go look at the port of Trieste, and you look at the distance from Trieste to Munich, right? It's only half the distance as from Hamburg to Munich. So it's the port of Hamburg that is afraid of Italy joining Belt and Road, because it doesn't like the idea that goods will come to Germany, to southern Germany, from Italy through Austria. That's what this was about. In other words, it's about competitive connectivity more than anything else, right? And I'll tell you another reason why. It's because I know a lot of young Italians. The University of Torino runs a program in the summer, and it has graduate students who go and they spend the summer in Beijing. They learn Mandarin. They do internships with Chinese companies. And when I go to the university campus in Beijing, and it's a room full of young Italians like this, I remember last summer when I said, "You are all the new Marco Polos," right? And they love that. Because this next generation, whether it's Italian or French or German, remember, they're not like us. For us, it would be impossible to start learning Mandarin today, right? But young people have actually grown up and they've already been studying Mandarin. I live in Singapore and I mentor Western students at the campus of Yale University, one of the oldest American universities, has a whole campus there. And I see waves of Americans coming in, and when they graduate, they say, "Yeah, I think I'll do that fellowship in Beijing," And these are, they look like your children, right? They're blonde or brown hair, but they speak fluent Mandarin. They don't care if they're doing their work in Chinese or in English or whatever. That's the next generation of global kids, right? And I see a lot of that out of Italy as well. So now, the other logic to it, let me bring the forces together here. There's the international connectivity of the infrastructure, there's the urbanization, and the urbanization is concentrated in the Asian cities. In this map, actually, you see the whole world's population. So 8 billion people are here on this map. Every human being is a pixel here. And yellow is the most dense geography. So again, it's a story about the Asian megacities, and I put the ovals around the most significant clusters. Now I want to say something as sort of a strategy point for EY, right? For EY, and also even for yourselves as clients and as global firms. When you are thinking about your global strategy, I said earlier, cities can be more important than countries, right? And this is a map that will be useful to you all the way to the year 2030, 2035, or beyond. Because to become a mega city, to become a place that has 30, 40 million people, to be the driver of an entire national or regional economy, that takes time. So if you are one of the ovals that I have put on this map, if you are one of those cities, you are going to remain in that position. So the question you ask yourselves is, where am I not, right? Why do I not have an office in Manila? Why am I not in Jakarta? Right? Why am I not in Ho Chi Minh City? Let's go and expand there, right? These are the places where you can be certain that the infrastructure investment, the demographic concentration, the urbanization, the business growth, the technology, the rise of the services economies, the financialization, the digitization, all of those things are being driven by the cities that are circled here. Absolutely all of them. Right? So this is a secular, in a way, view of the world that is around urbanization and connectivity and identifying for you the geographies where you want to be operating. And I mentioned Belt and Road already. Let me talk about the role of Europe more broadly in this. I described earlier the way in which the German hesitation about the Belt and Road Initiative versus China embracing it has caused tension within Europe. But as a whole, here in Europe, you are very well poised to take advantage of the rise of Asia and the shift from a transatlantic world to a Eurasian world. Now, we all grew up in a transatlantic era. Even I did. I shuttled between Germany and the United States when I was young. And for me also, the Western order was considered the central geopolitical fact of the world. But truly, that is the past. And what is already true today, and most certainly will be in the future, is this Eurasian system. Because look at this number, $1.6 trillion. That's the largest number of these three in this triangular trading system. The 1.6 trillion represents the value of just the goods trade, so not even services, not even the digital services, but very difficult to quantify. In economics, we have a very hard time quantifying services trade still. But just the goods trade across Eurasia is already the largest axis of trade in the world today. And that's before you have the full implementation of the EU-Japan Free Trade Agreement, before you have the EU-ASEAN, that's Southeast Asia, Free Trade Agreement, which is just beginning the negotiation, before you have any free trade agreement with India, which is just the early stage conversations, and before China begins to open up further the way it is promising to do and the way there is strong pressure from Europe on China to do. So what will this number be in 10 years, right? It could be $2.5 trillion, it could be $3 trillion, right? So the focus, your mental shift, the focus on the Eurasian business opportunities is absolutely crucial. And that's why in this trade war, where one focuses too much on just the US-China dynamic, you should be actually looking at how Europe is playing this more. And here you see a clear evidence of Europe decoupling in some ways from the United States and not wanting to be as punitive when it can be more constructive, if you will. And I think Europe is doing the right thing. So, last couple of points, and this does go back to Marco Polo's world, if you will. In the course of my research, when I was looking at the growing patterns of trade networks and the flows of commodities and goods and people and so forth, in the 21st century, and realizing that the Indian Ocean region, right, is becoming the new center of global trade, linking Africa, the Near East, and East Asia. The term that historians use for the previous period of history, when that was already true, is Afro-Eurasia. And I like this word because it brings together Africa, Europe, and Asia. And this is also, interestingly enough, not new. This was the pre-colonial world. The 14th century was like this. The 15th century was like this, right? It was already a world in which this was the center of gravity. These were the major trading networks. And think about Italy's geography, right? So crucial as a gateway, as a bridge. Right now, when you think about your relations with Africa, obviously it's focused almost entirely on the migration issue. But for 25 years, Europe has been talking about the need to trade more with Africa, invest more in Africa, develop those markets more. And now you realize that you should have done more of it, right? Because if you had done that, there may not be as much of a migration crisis, but perhaps it's not too late. But it's not just Africa, obviously. It's the Arab world, it's Iran when Iran opens, and of course, it is the rise of Asia as well. So I'm actually optimistic about Europe's position in this future, because of the geography, because of the openness to connecting with these regions, because of course many of the highest growing parts of the world are in fact places that are former European colonies, right? But you're going back to them now in a non-colonial way, of course, in a much more balanced kind of way, and in a context where some of your main competitors in the industrial sense, also in the digital sense, it could be American companies or others, are having a difficult time in these markets. But around the world, wherever I go, especially in post-colonial regions, which is most of the world, right? Most of the world is post-colonial countries that were born after 1945, right? I see that people want to have European standards of products. They want European forms of government. They want smart cities like Europe has. They want the sustainability, right? The consumer protection, regulatory standpoint. Europe still not only stands for these things intellectually or rhetorically, it actually embodies a lot of these things. So I think Europe can have a tremendous amount of influence in the 21st century as well. So a final point comes back to the virtue of connectivity, right? Whether it is physical, whether it is in transportation, whether it's in energy networks, whether it's digital, it is that the more we invest in connectivity between ourselves and the rest of the world, the more we actually wind up building a better, a stronger, a more resilient global system. Why? It's because of the fact that even though a country like China is building Belt and Road, building these highways and railways for its own interest, right? It's doing it for itself. It's not doing it just as a gift for its neighbors. But it becomes infrastructure and resources that everyone can actually use, right? And when every country starts to build these infrastructures, physical and digital, in their own interest, it adds up again to something greater. Think about the internet. There is not one internet. And even if one country, one power, one agency developed the internet, today we have 8 or 9 layers and redundancies and backups of the internet. Even if you created it, you cannot destroy it, right? It is a system that we would describe as anti-fragile, right? Maybe you're familiar with this term from the great scholar Nassim Taleb. He uses the term anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is a system that doesn't just have the property of resilience. It gets better. It gets stronger over time. And globalization is an anti-fragile system, right? It becomes broader. It becomes deeper all the time as a result of all the connectivity we invest in. So look at energy markets. Here are the three dots, or the choke points in global maritime trade and the movement of goods. The Straits of Hormuz, the Straits of Malacca, the Suez Canal. If you have a blockage in any of these, like think about when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, oil prices go through the roof, right? But now we have a world where we have distributed oil production. We have tremendous gas supplies as well that have come on stream. So we have global commodities markets. So when there is an attack like in Saudi oil facilities a few weeks ago, prices go up for a little bit, but then they come back down, right? The trend is towards abundance of supply and the infrastructure that connects supply to demand. So whether you are moving oil, whether you are moving goods, whether you are moving data, by living in a connected world, by building a connected world, right, we are building a more anti-fragile world. And that is something that we don't appreciate in the narrow sense, but in the longer term, that's exactly what we're doing. So building a more connected world means building a better world. And that applies no matter what domain of human activity you are talking about. So with that, I hope to leave you with some positive thoughts and strategic thinking that will shape your conversation today and your business strategy in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Grazie. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, thank you so much. So in 2009, you gave your first TED Talk in Oxford, and I was there in the audience. 2 years after, you gave a second TED Talk in Edinburgh, I was in the audience. And several years ago, you gave a TED Talk in Vancouver, and I was in the audience. Now I'm on the stage, so I'm so glad about it. Such a pleasure.
And
I have the opportunity. I have the opportunity to have you already replied to many of the questions we have about Silk Road, the destiny of Italy, or whatever. I have a personal question. It's about Hong Kong. You mentioned Hong Kong several times. Something big is going on in Hong Kong starting on June. How you think is going to end up? What's the movement, the protest in Hong Kong? China is going to manage it in a peaceful way or not?
Well, it's already not managing it in a peaceful way.
No, not peaceful, definitely.
It's not managing it in a way that any of us would want it to manage it. But
do they have another opportunity?
When you ask how will it end, I don't think that one can say how it ends, because that would mean that it began in June. But this process began 22 years ago.
Yeah.
22 years ago. When the handover happened, it was written into the agreement that a quota of mainland Chinese people could move into Hong Kong legally, right, every year. And in over 22 years, legally, just the legal part, has been more than 1 million people, about 1.2 million people, right? Now, again, it is ugly, but what China wants to do has been what it has been doing, right? And you could say it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? We will change this law, we will arrest this person, we will ban this activity, we will manipulate this parliamentary clause, we will install this figure, we will kick out these people. Right now, what they're doing is, they're punishing the equity markets and the real estate markets so that they can come and buy in. So none of these things, add up to Hong Kong being able to restore what it was.
So it's not going to be an happy ending story. No way.
Not for Hong Kong as we knew it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Parag. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.